Hi everyone, we'll just wait a couple of minutes and let everyone get into the webinar before we get started. We'll wait a little bit longer. If you want to talk amongst yourself in the chat function, you can do while we wait for everyone to come in. Hi, Fiona. How you doing? Okay, how are we doing? I'll make a start, and then if I talk very slowly, then people can still come in. Right. Okay, so hello everyone again. Welcome to another one of the Icon Conservation Together at Home series. Remember the hashtag Conservation Together at Home if you want to join us on Twitter or any other social media. And apologies in advance for any technical difficulties if we get into them, because we're all relying on our home Wi-Fi and computers and things like that. So, but hopefully we'll be okay today. And today we have Emily Williams speaking to us, which is really exciting because she's not a book and paper conservator, so we're learning something a bit new today. She's Associate Professor of Archaeological Conservation at Durham University, and her talk is about sustaining objects, narrative and outreach. And like always, if you have any questions, you can pop them into the Q&A function at any point during the talk, and we can save them all up for the end. Okay, so I will let Emily start to talk. Okay.
Good morning, or good afternoon, sorry. Can you hear me? Yeah. So last year, the American Institute for the Conservation of Historic and Artistic Works announced the results of a branding initiative. In addition to shortening the name to the much simpler American Institute for Conservation, the logo was redesigned and the website was changed. Although no one batted an eye at the name change, the other two changes ignited a firestorm on AIC's member community. The debate, which raged for weeks and involved over 300 messages, addressed issues of governance, aesthetics, inclusivity, and modes of communication. But at its most fundamental level, it was about identity. Who are conservators in the 21st century, and what attributes set them apart from other heritage professionals? These were questions that resonated for me because I had been asking myself versions of them since I took over the direction of the MA in Conservation of Archaeological Museum Objects program at Durham earlier that year. I'd been quizzing conservators, alumni, and current students from around the world about what skills they felt were most important. Everyone I talked to reiterated the importance of the skills that have traditionally been at the heart of conservation. Hand skills, literacy, documentation, close observation of objects, an awareness of the way in which deterioration alters the piece, and critical thinking. As a profession, although the way we practice some of these skills may change, for example, the move away from drawing and 35mm photography to digital images and the use of Photoshop. The skill sets that are embedded in both icons professional standards, and AIC's competencies for the conservator continue to be foundational. When I moved my discussions with alumni and conservation colleagues beyond the skills that they felt a conservator needs and asked about the skills that they used on a daily basis, most people talked about the soft skills that they felt conservators need to develop, such as leadership, negotiation, team building, and confidence. These lists tend to be highly personalized and speak both to the development of the person's own career and values and to that of the profession as a whole. Like the colleagues I have spoken to, I bring my own personal history to the list of soft skills that I feel are important and that I wish to share with my students. Today, I would like to talk about one of the skills I value, storytelling, and the role that narrative plays in sustaining objects and in sustaining conservation. Before I begin, I would like to apologize for adopting what one of my students recently referred to as the Gilderoy Lockhart approach to public speaking. I have peppered this talk with stories from my own experience, not because they're any better, more valid, or more informative than others, but rather because they are the lens through which I have become engaged with the topic. My introduction to conservation was on an archaeological dig in Tunisia. We were excavating the circus in Carthage, and we were given a presentation on the conservation of curse tablets from the site. These tablets are inscribed pieces of lead intended to influence the actions or welfare of people or animals through supernatural means. Hexes were written on the tablet, which was then folded up and buried or nailed in a place connected with the subject of the curse. A series of tablets from different time periods were found nailed to the floors of the circus during the multi-year excavations. Our presenter focused on the careful conservation work needed to soften the lead corrosion, gradually unroll the tablets and read them, and then proceeded to discuss the curses. Their connection to the 4 official racing teams and how some research suggested that due to imperial patronage of certain teams, supporting or opposing one was a form of political expression. What struck me at the time was the way in which conservation connected the past and the present, made the past somehow seem more immediate and more accessible. Fans rooting for their teams and hurling invective at other teams resonates in the present. It tells a story that is relatable. Narrative and interpretation lie at the heart of conservation, and it is important to think about how the field designs and produces its stories. In order to do this, it is necessary to pause just for a moment and to think about meta-narratives, essentially narratives about narratives. Meta-narratives have been described as recurrent skeletal stories belonging to cultures and individuals that play a powerful role in questions of identity, values, and the understanding of life. Conservation has explored 3 important meta-narratives over its history. The first and oldest is the scientific one. Its origins lie in the Enlightenment era belief that the world could be understood through the study and classification of natural and historic materials. As cabinets of curiosities morphed into public collections whose aims were to improve and enlighten the populace, artifacts were conceived of as having an inherent material truth that transcended the subjective narratives of diarists, collectors, and even curators. 19th century scientists studied the nature of materials and the mechanisms of decay. And when conservation emerged as a discrete field in the 20th century, its focus was on technological study, deterioration, and treatments rooted in scientific inquiry. As an emerging profession, conservation sought to distance itself from traditional craft-based approaches to restoration which it labeled as subjective enterprises driven by changeable aesthetic practices at odds with its own objective and neutral approach. The narrative that science sustains objects was in keeping with the societal belief that science paved the way to a better future. There is a certainty that scientific data produces. Analyses, spectra, X-ray, and photomicrographs have allowed conservators to prevail in cleaning debates and to arbitrate questions of provenance. The idea that science sustains objects remains a powerful narrative that can differentiate conservators from their colleagues in museums and connect them to audiences who might not resonate to the artistic qualities of the objects. But it has perhaps been a borrowed story, as the rapid explosion of new analytical instrumentation has highlighted. Conservators have struggled to keep up with all the possibilities for analyzing objects. New modes of scientific engagement with artifacts, such as technical art history, have emerged, and new voices have told similar stories. Where once the scientific narrative gave conservators authority and comfort, the growing disconnect between the ways in which conservators can theoretically analyze objects and the methods that many have at their disposal may now be contributing to a lack of confidence. I recently attended a conference that had a mixture of well-funded projects run by consortiums of scientists and conservators, and projects run by experienced and very skilled conservators who worked in small labs. And I was disheartened to hear several of the latter apologize for a lack of science in their paper. In each case, the paper lacked neither scientific method nor rigor. What it lacked in the diversity of analytical techniques employed was made up by the strength of the diagnostic skills used. Although the narrative that science sustains objects will always be an important one in conservation, it is important for us to remember that more science does not always equal good science, and to focus on the attributes that make our use of science unique. We must accept that conservation is not a science, but rather a humanities-based discipline that utilizes scientific methods to aid in the interpretation of evidence and the solution of problems. And we must find new questions and new theoretical frameworks that allow us to evaluate the information provided by scientists. One project that has done a wonderful job of this is the Metropolitan Museum of Art's restoration of Tullio Lombardo's Adam. The plywood plinth on which the statue stood collapsed, causing Adam, an early Renaissance masterpiece, to fall and shatter into 28 major fragments and hundreds of smaller pieces. Over the course of the 12-year project, the team utilized 3D modeling techniques to do finite element analysis and to map the stresses and strains on each fragment of the statue, tested adhesives, and pioneered new approaches to pinning. Project videos and exhibits frame the use of science in service to the diagnosis of the problems and the goals of restoring the aesthetic appeal and spirit of the statue. They also managed to turn an embarrassing lapse in stewardship to a success story that was nationally and internationally acclaimed. The success of the Met's project leads us to the second meta-narrative that conservators have been developing, which we might dub the "we sustain objects" narrative. In part, a response to the idea that images of disembodied hands working on artifacts or lab coat-clad conservators peering down microscopes tended to distance the conservator from both the object and the observer and obscure the intimate relationship that conservators have with objects and often with the people who made them and used them. This narrative foregrounds the process of conservation and the actions of the conservator through accessible labs, exhibits, and websites. The public's appetite for this sort of how things are done approach has recently been dubbed process porn, and it can be similarly undiscerning at times, with little distinction made between how-to videos and more nuanced and thoughtful approaches. Conservators often worry that listeners may be seeking DIY tips and not listening to the important framing elements or acknowledging the skill and education needed to achieve the results. Facebook groups, such as art conservation advocates, have been established to provide critiques and apply correctives they feel are missing. However, one of the tremendous strengths of this approach is that by situating the conservator in the moment that they are encountering the object and making the conservation process transparent, including missteps, doubts, and interpretations, the activity of knowledge production is highlighted. The task is no longer a technical one, which is predetermined by the materials from which the object is made, but a more reflexive one, which has a face and is accessible. The strength of this conservation narrative lies in the fact that its accounts are anchored in the physical reality of artifacts, remains, and the traces left by real people in a real past. By engaging the public in these discussions and in the multiple stories that artifacts have to tell, we have the ability not only to foster connections with the past, but also to teach people about our values and our work. As a conservator at the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation, I curated an exhibit entitled Conservation, Where Art and Science Meet, which delivered this sort of process-driven narrative. I was seeking to build on other exhibits, such as York Castle Museum's wonderful Stop the Rot exhibit, which had taken similar approaches, and also on feedback from the extremely successful behind-the-scenes lab tours, which we already ran as a department. The exhibit sought to highlight the Foundation's diverse collections, capture the enthusiasm that the visitors felt when visiting the Foundation's labs, and offer them a structured learning experience. In addition to our own collections, a range of objects, including spacesuit parts, self-adhering photo albums, polar fleece gloves, pocket watches, and cassettes were used to highlight the evolving nature of the materials we conserve. Conservators were included wherever possible in the exhibit to humanize the decisions that are made about objects and to convey the notion that the landscape of cultural heritage is not the realm of anonymous cabals, but is populated by everyday people and is accessible to all. A brief introductory video introduced the conservation team and showed them at work. Narrated PowerPoint presentations allowed visitors to engage in the decision-making processes. Photos of conservators at work were included, and a life-size cutout of a conservator dominated one of the visual axes. You can just see that in the middle of this slide. Finally, the exhibit was supported by an ambitious raft of educational programs. The exhibit's design was crisp and industrial. Mounts and other fittings were obvious and were not painted out. In one case, the control box for the fiber optic lights was very clearly visible. This helped to convey a sense of going behind the scenes and help capture the intimacy often felt in the labs. Objects were shown in various states of undress, partially disassembled or at angles that visitors were unused to heighten the perception of being an insider. From the start, the exhibit was conceived not only as an educational experience in its own right, but also as a set which the conservators could use to teach guests more about conservation. weekly Meet the Conservator tours were held in the space. Led by one of the Foundation's 10 conservators, these tours focused on the exhibit and processes of conservation from that conservator's perspective. Each of the conservators focused on artifacts from their media. They explained the treatments undertaken, the decisions made, and highlighted the backstories. This provided an effective way to extend the narrative, engage in a discourse, and encourage visitors to stay longer and engage with the process. It also permitted us to tell people-centered narratives. One of my favorite objects, which I focused my tours on, was a watering can, excavated by Ivanhoe Hume in 1964 at the site of Matthews Manor. It is believed to be of Flemish origin and was discarded no later than 1650 when the property burned. The spout had separated from the body and the can was heavily corroded when it was found. After an extended correspondence with A.E. Werner at the British Museum, Noel Hume decided not to treat it. The object was stable, and the treatment that Werner had championed, sodium sesquicarbonate, although well regarded within the conservation field, was one that Noel Hume disliked. So he decided to wait until new treatments were developed. This decision offered an interesting sub-story about the evolution of the conservation field and prompted discussion with visitors about how conservation decisions were made, when we could treat objects with the technology at hand, and when we should wait for new technologies to be developed. In the late 1990s, the object was treated in preparation for an exhibit. X-rays were taken and showed that it had an elaborate and previously unguessed at relief decorative scheme consisting of a series of grape clusters hanging over and under a central vine. Additionally, 2 panels of a slightly thicker gauge were added to the areas where the handle meets the body to reinforce the join and prevent the handle from ripping away from the body when the can was full. The X-rays dramatically illustrated the degree of damage that the watering can had suffered, revealing areas where there is no remaining core metal and extensive cracking. Putting these details together demonstrates the power of X-rays and other forms of analyses. And when coupled with the other steps of the conservation process, including stabilization and mount making, tells an interesting technical tale. But there was one story left for this artifact to impart to our audiences. It was created just as gardening was beginning to evolve into a leisure activity for the wealthy, and was possibly brought to Virginia prior to John Tradescant the Younger's arrival on his first plant collecting expedition. The watering can's ornate surface emphasizes its high status. The decision to bring it to the New World represents a powerful statement about the hope of finding a new life in the colonies. Its owner was declaring that he envisioned a life where he would have significant time for leisure and scientific activities and might, in essence, find a land of milk and honey. Although Samuel Matthews, the builder of Matthews Manor, ultimately became one of the wealthiest and most influential men in the colony, the other materials found at the site suggest that this was the result of tremendous industry, including blacksmithing, shoemaking, weaving, and the distilling of turpentine, as well as trade in pitch and tar, and that probably he had very little time for leisure. The watering can permitted me to chat to visitors about items which similarly captured the hopes and/or sorrows of their families. One of the most evocative stories that a visitor shared with me was of a Christmas star. Known to his family as David Starr, it was associated with the death of his uncle David from appendicitis during the Depression. The family had been unable to come up with the money for medical treatment, and had incorporated David's memory into every Christmas celebration, to the extent that younger generations of the family now scour antique stores for David stars for their own trees. These sorts of moments were important because they moved the dialogue about conservation out of the museum setting and demonstrated that cultural heritage is present in everyday life and that its preservation can involve everybody. In a recent edition of Icon News, Simon Kane stated that for him, conservation is about helping people to enjoy and use objects effectively, and is no longer simply about protecting the object. This is a point that resonates for me and that I would wholeheartedly agree with. The discussions about the watering can demonstrated that the value of a piece does not necessarily lie just in its age or its unique nature, but also in its ability to connect us with the past, to humanize it, and to illuminate our own histories. And so we encounter conservation's third meta-narrative, that objects sustain us. Stories are both planned and carefully crafted, and spontaneous and freighted with emotion. The image on the screen now represents one of the most profound moments I have had as a conservator. In 2004, 2 tombstones were excavated in Williamsburg, Virginia. Both were erected by Alexander Dunlop, a free Black man, to memorialize his enslaved family members. His wife died in 1866, the year after she had become emancipated by the ending of the Civil War. And the tombstone he commissioned is a complex object which, through its placement, choice of materials, decoration, carvers, and text, speaks to his belief in her equality and worth. The object was powerful, and in addition to working with members of the First Baptist Church, one of the oldest Black churches in America, to ensure that it could be exhibited, that it would be exhibited and not lost in storage. Dunlop was very active with the church as a deacon and head of its board of trustees, so they were excited to tell the stories. Exhibition funding was eventually secured, and in 2015, just as I was completing the treatment and coming to the end of the resulting PhD, a colleague asked if she could bring a friend to visit the lab. Unbeknownst to either of us, her friend turned out to be Alexander Dunlop's great-granddaughter. He had remarried after his wife's death and had 2 children. The death of his second wife and then his death a few years later meant that the children were raised by their stepmother, his third wife. Moves, marriages, and subsequent name changes had made them difficult to locate despite my best efforts. This unexpected and very serendipitous moment quickly reduced us all to tears, but was mixed with a great sense of joy. The great-granddaughter did not know of the tombstone's existence or much about her great-grandfather. She too had become a Baptist preacher. For her, touching the tombstone and the physical contact with her family's past was important. She prayed over them in the lab, and a few months later helped to lead the service that welcomed the tombstones back into the church community and celebrated the unveiling of the exhibit dedicated to them in the church. Numerous Dunlop descendants were present, but one of the most touching comments came from an unrelated church member who noted that the stones and Dunlop's connection with the church afforded a sense of communal ancestry for both the church and the community that genealogical searches could not always provide for individual members, given the ways in which slavery and the Great Migration had disrupted family ties. The archaeologist Elizabeth Rudebeck has written that narratives and all other forms of telling about the past presuppose an image of the present. Images of the present are the point of departure for images of the past, while at the same time, the past defines the present. Although it is not her primary point, she highlights the cyclical nature of writing about the past. By conserving the past, we hold a mirror to our own society. And as we do that, we hold the potential to alter our society. Surely then, the more inclusive the process is, the more dynamic it also becomes. Conservators' abilities to tell stories that connect people and things across time, and to highlight both materials and materiality in a unique way, offer our field both relevance and resilience. And in this, there lies a power to challenge ingrained and embedded histories, to imply restorative justice, and to remake worlds. The work we do as conservators can be romantic, amazing, and heroic, and this is something that others have noticed and used. It is important to remain aware of the ways that others tell stories about us and to critically engage with those stories. Do they contain stereotypes? Is this good or bad? Do they hold opportunities to advance our own narratives? One of the exercises I have done with students for several years is to have them examine different descriptions of conservators in novels and in the press. They are asked to list the attributes they see, come up with a label for them, and then discuss both the positives and negatives associated with those stereotypes. For example, in Arturo Pérez Reverte's novel, The Flanders Panel, the protagonist, Julia, is a paintings conservator. Her studio is described in great detail, as are her work habits. She is an artist and a connoisseur, well-respected, successful, although young, but also a bit of a renegade. She is someone who enjoys an unusually intimate relationship with art, who lives with it and reads it as few others do, and who doggedly seeks to understand any anomalies that are encountered. Many conservators would find such a description very appealing if applied to them, and in Pérez Reverte's hands, there is a depth that steers clear of caricature. But in less able hands, conservators can become typecast and pigeonholed. The resulting stereotypes, the aesthete, the artist, the miracle worker, the super sleuth, can be useful, but also have their pitfalls. Sometimes it is to our advantage to use them and to play on the connoisseur's knowledge, the detective's insight, and the miraculous healing power of the doctor, or to invoke the societal reverence for an artist's skills or the knowledge and the objectivity of the scientist. However, it is also important to recognize that for every positive understanding of a characterization, there is a negative. The aesthete's love of art gives way to elitism and an ivory tower mentality. The counterpoint of the successful artist is the starving artist, fey and out of touch with reality. The persistence of a detective can slide into obsession, and the objectivity of the scientist can teeter into emotional coldness and a relationship with data that is at times disordered. There is often, therefore, a benefit to counteracting these stereotypes. Narratives speak to our identities, but they may also impose identities upon us, and it is important to be mindful of that when engaging with the process. My point, however, is not that we all need to take up writing fiction and write better, truer novels about conservation. It is that there is a place for storytelling in our professional writing as well. It offers a way to talk about some of the connections and emotions that our work inspires and to explore the meanings behind it. In short, to theorize about our own identities and the way our work shapes and is shaped by a series of other factors. To acknowledge that the field is not just determined by the chemical processes of deterioration and stabilization, or defined by the elegance of technical solutions, but also by the ways in which we make sense of the past by working through objects and the value that accretes through that process. Conservators have traditionally embraced scientific writing styles, but there is room for narrative in the field, and not solely on websites or in exhibits, but in our own technical writing. Object biography and microhistory are just two of the narrative methods that offer useful tools. Although neither is particularly new, both hold great promise for conservation. Object biography allows us to tell vertical stories about the history of an object, when it was made, how it became damaged, what intervention occurred. That builds on the ways we already structure treatment reports and the ways in which we sustain objects. Microhistory allows for more horizontal explorations of an object's history and the conservator's engagement with it. It often privileges both firsthand accounts and the reconstruction of social networks, including those created between the object and the people it has encountered. As a technique, it offers tremendous potential for multivocality and for engaging with the objects in which, and for engaging with the ways in which objects sustain us. Storytelling offers us ways to explore both our own identities and those of objects. It has been my experience that telling stories about conservation has helped me to examine and refine the way in which I view the field. Reflection is baked into the process, not only in the decisions about what can be elided and where the focus should lie, how the parts should be arranged, but reflection is also present in responding to the listener, gauging responses, and making amendments on the fly. There is an element of co-creation that helps the listener or reader value the product more. As we emerge from the pandemic into what will undoubtedly be a slightly altered heritage landscape, we will need to tell new stories about objects and about ourselves in order to help examine our responses and in order to help facilitate new relationships between objects and people. Embrace and enjoy that challenge. Thank you. Here are some references, some additional references that might be helpful.
Brilliant, thank you so much. That was really interesting and an insightful talk. Thank you so much. I'll wait for maybe some questions to come in, but yeah. It reminded me of, there's this program on BBC at the moment called The Repair Shop. I don't know if anyone's watching that, but that's it's not quite strictly conservation, but it's repair and restoring. But the stories that they tell through these objects and the things that they mean to the people that bring them in have really resonated with a lot of the public. And it's like, you know, a primetime TV show. So if anyone's looking for inspiration on how to tell stories through through one object that means much, you know, when you see the people, their reaction to the work that the conservators and restorers have done, it's quite lovely. So I would recommend that program to anyone. Or we have a question. Let's have a little look. So I'll just read this out. So Angela says, I have often felt that there is a great appetite in the general public for behind the scenes or lab tours, and that is the feedback we always got during such events. However, these initiatives are sometimes met with a lack of support or even resistance by employers. How would you suggest we lobby our own employers to bring conservation and science to a wider audience?
That's such a good question, and surprising, because I've often found that employers have enjoyed, particularly in the States, where I spent most of my career so far, the employers quickly saw how useful the tours were for fundraising and encouraged us to do many of them. And occasionally we had to sort of say, whoa, we've got to do some work. We've got to have something new to say here. I think that showing that excitement, documenting it. We had, with our behind the scenes tours in Williamsburg, we had little surveys that people could fill out. And we also did focus groups once with both members of the tour, and also we had volunteer tour guides who led the visitors through our facility so that the conservator didn't have to take the time to go collect them. And they fed back a lot of the comments that they received about it. And what we started, that program started as a temporary program to celebrate the opening of our building. And 18 years later, we're still running strong 3 times a week, full tours each week. So it was very popular, and people saw that.
Yeah, I think definitely that fundraising. I'm sure most of the people that come around where I work they're trying to get them to open their wallets a little bit. So you can always say it that way. Yeah, I'll add like the project I'm working on at the moment. Well, I'm not working on it right now, but it's to move a collection to a new storage building that is going to be incredibly public. Very open access, so I'm sure people can work out where I work for, but that's quite a kind of that would be quite an interesting project to look at when and if that all comes together at some point after lockdown, how new buildings and new places are going to be dealing with public access, and even if we are behind glass, are people going to come in groups and stuff like that now? That'd be quite interesting to see if plans will change on that sort of front as well.
Social distancing will add a
yeah.
new yeah.
We have a couple of requests for Catherine asked, can you repeat the name of the archaeologist author, but I'm not sure which one she's.
Is it Elizabeth Rudebeck?
Elizabeth
Rudebeck.
Okay, maybe we'll type it out later for people. And we've got Lindsay asking, do you see any accountability in the field concerning videos, tutorials concerning the fear of the DIY concept? How do we encourage the public to engage with us without accidentally promoting DIY?
That is a hard question. I think, so my experience has been that actually the more the public sees what we do, the more frightened they are to do it themselves. And I speak from the experience of when I first arrived in Virginia and started working at Williamsburg, the historical archaeologists in the area had a robust tradition of doing their own restoration and conservation on their finds. And by being really open, by inviting them into the labs, by talking to their field schools, by doing tours, by engaging with them at conferences, and I was not alone in this. There were other archaeological conservators in Virginia doing the same thing. But the feedback to us was that it actually dissuaded people because they saw how complicated it was to do it correctly. And they began to value conservators who took the time to do it that way more. And they began to build some funds, still maybe not quite enough, always, into their excavations. So so engagement helped in that instance. I think with videos it's a little harder because you're sort of casting it out there, and it's hard to engage and answer questions in the same way.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think so. Some of the things I've seen recently is quite the like some of the documentaries that you can find. Like there's been a recent one at the V&A. I think they do really try and highlight how specialized it is, and that it is a real, it is that mix of science and craft and care, and they're not quite encouraging anyone to just like go and wash their Mary Quant dresses themselves and stuff like that. So it's a balance in that. I think it depends on who's editing and who's telling that story as well. I think maybe.
I think we also have to be aware that, you know, there are people who are going to take action no matter what, and we're never going to convince them. And we can't not engage with the world for fear of empowering those people. It's much better to engage with the broader majority and to keep engaging with them than to worry solely about our engaged, you know, about how we empower that average group.
Yeah. Yeah, and if it's their things, you know, let them get on with their own things. Yeah. Great, thank you so much. We have a few requests for like the links and stuff and names of people, so perhaps we'll try and get them on the Conservation Together at Home webpage, like underneath the YouTube video when we put it up there, so everyone can go and read all these lovely resources as well. That'd be really good. Okay, I think that's all the questions we have right now. And we have lots of messages on the chat saying thank you very much for a really insightful and interesting talk. So thank you so much for speaking to all us today. It was really great. Thank you.
Thank you for letting me.
No, it's great. Thank you so much. Okay, right. So we'll stop there, and I just got time to say that the next talk is on Tuesday, the 12th of May, and we have Christina Bean talking about building community conservation after the Montecito mudslide. So that's another interesting talk that I'm really looking forward to. So hopefully we'll see you all there. Brilliant. Okay. See you later, everyone. Take care. Bye. Oh, and